We're getting our very first look at the first batch of transcripts from witnesses in the impeachment investigation into Donald Trump. They provide a breathtaking and disturbing look at how lifelong diplomats were threatened, intimidated, coerced, and smeared by Donald Trump and his allies. The transcripts paint a devastating picture of a foreign policy process twisted and contorted to serve Donald Trump's political ambitions, not U.S. national security. And if a single fact pattern emerges from the nearly 500 pages of sworn testimony, it's the constant and repeated clash between Donald Trump's attempts at corrupting U.S. foreign policy to smear political opponents and the quiet resistance to his corruption from career public servants with decades of service to United States presidents under Republicans and Democrats. Also clear in the transcripts released today is the subversion of bilateral relationships with the security interests of U.S. allies at their core. In their place, a transactional policy agenda with Donald Trump's political aims at its core. From that transcript of the interview with former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, it becomes clear that she feared for her safety, that her calls to the State Department went largely unanswered, and that the danger she represented to Donald Trump was that she was onto him and his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. From those transcripts, on the call she received from the Director General of the Foreign Service, who called Yovanovitch in April to tell her she should get on the next plane home. Yovanovitch said she didn't know what was happening, but there was a lot of nervousness on the 7th floor and up the street, meaning at the White House. Yovanovitch goes on. She called me about an hour later, so now it's 1 a.m. in the Ukraine. She said there was a lot of concern for me and that I needed to be on the next plane home to Washington. And I was like, what? What happened? And she said, I don't know, but this is about your security. You need to come home immediately. Yovanovitch makes clear that she still feels threatened. Also from today's transcripts, Yovanovitch was asked about part of the White House summary of Trump's call with Ukrainian President Zelensky, in which he attacks her. Yovanovitch testified to this, quote, I was shocked. I was very surprised that President Trump would, first of all, that I would feature repeatedly in a presidential phone call. But secondly, that the president would speak about me or any ambassador in that way to a foreign counterpart. Yovanovitch has asked further questions about that call summary in her deposition. She says this, quote, at the bottom of that same, this is the question, at the bottom of that same page, President Trump says, well, she's going to go through some things. What did you understand that to mean? Yovanovitch replies, I didn't know what it meant. I was very concerned. I still am. The questioner continues, did you feel threatened? Yovanovitch, yes. The transcripts also reveal the depth of Yovanovitch and her Ukrainian counterparts' misgivings about Ukraine becoming embroiled in American domestic politics, with one of her contacts there saying, quote, getting into U.S. politics would be a dangerous place for Ukraine to be. That is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. From the Washington Post, White House Bureau Chief Phil Rucker, plus former Chief of Staff to Vice Presidents Joe Biden and Al Gore, and advisor to the Biden campaign, Ron Klain. With us at the table, former Republican Congressman, now an independent, David Jolly, Chief Public Affairs Officer for MoveOn.org, Karine Jean-Pierre, and former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama, Ben Rhodes. Ben, I have to start with you. I didn't get all the way through this, but I read big chunks of it. The tension in her voice, and it's hard to articulate how tough and how seasoned a diplomat like Marie Yovanovitch is, and they all are by and large. But to hear her talk about being threatened and feeling so threatened in her posting, not from the Ukrainians, but from her domestic enemies in the Trump White House, was chilling.
Yeah, first of all, she'd been in the Foreign Service for decades, served in some tough places, and never experienced something like that because nothing like that had ever happened before, because that's not how we conduct foreign policy in the United States. The other thing I take away from this, Nicole, is so much of the focus has been on this one phone call. And what this lays out is that this was a multi-month-long effort to essentially completely corrupt the relationship between the United States and Ukraine to serve Trump's interests. She was an obstacle because she didn't want to go along with Rudy Giuliani moonlighting as kind of a shadow Secretary of State and trying to get this dirt on Biden. And for that, You've got the president of the United States disparaging her to a foreign leader. And not only does that not serve the national interest of the United States, it actually actively undermines the national security of the United States. Our national security interest in Ukraine is to buttress them against a Russian invasion. Our national interest in Ukraine is to have a solid working relationship, a solid assistance relationship where they get the military they need. And Trump essentially was putting all of that at risk just to get this one outcome of an investigation into Joe Biden that does nothing to fight corruption in Ukraine, does nothing to help any U.S. national interests. It's a chilling read.
You know, Phil Rucker, it's so interesting that the Republican position, and I know we're all living dog years covering this impeachment, but it was just a few short days ago that they stormed the SCIFs. They stormed the secure briefing rooms for transparency. Well, you know, how about that transparency? It's a brutal, brutal takedown of what I think, as Ben said, sort of the corruption of this relationship with an American ally, all in the service of dirt on the Bidens.
Yeah, Nicole, what happened today is exactly what Republicans and the president himself have been clamoring for weeks, which is to see the full transcripts, to let the American people hear everything that these witnesses are saying, because they thought that the Democrats, that Chairman Adam Schiff and others, were selectively leaking out details from the testimony into the media over the last few weeks. Well, now we've seen the full transcript from some of these key witnesses, including the ambassador. And there's no way to describe this other than a pretty devastating portrayal of the way foreign policy was conducted by the Trump administration and by the president himself with regards to Ukraine over these last few months. The president has not reacted fully yet to what's unfolded today. He has been fixated on defending his conduct in that one phone call with President Zelensky of Ukraine as perfect or perfecto, to use the words that he's been using the last few days.
Always fun to quote him.
But as Ben just pointed out, this is about so much more than that phone call, and it's about an entire pattern and work product of foreign policy in the administration that he's going to have to answer for at some point.
You know, David Jolly, you look at public opinion, and I'm fascinated by this, mostly because I was so exasperated that after Mueller came out with 400 pages of at best, misconduct from Donald Trump and his campaign, it didn't move a blip. This has swung so dramatically, I think, because it's not just a phone call. It never was just a phone call. And if they brazenly released a phone call, that was obviously the tip of the iceberg. I want to read what Ambassador Sondland asked her to do, because I was a communications director on a campaign, and I wasn't this ham-handed as a campaign manager. So Yovanovitch testifies at Sondland. That's Donald Trump's political appointee who served as the ambassador to the EU. He's in the middle of all this. He's testified to a quid pro quo, one of 3 Trump advisors to have done so. But this is him trying to help Yovanovitch save herself. He said, this is Yovanovitch's testimony. Sondland said, you need to go big or go home. You need to, tweet out that you support the president and that all these are lies and everything else. And, obviously that was advice. It was advice that I did not see how I could implement in my role as an ambassador or as a foreign service officer. So I don't know, Sondland, but either he's as corrupt as the rest of them or just stupid. But who asks a career foreign service officer to tweet out a campaign endorsement?
No, I
that
think
was stunning.
It's the former, and very importantly about Sondland's profile, he is the benefactor who gave $1 million to Trump to get an ambassadorship. Stands in stark contrast to somebody like Yovanovitch or McKinley, who are career foreign service officers that uphold the dignity and integrity of the State Department in the United States. Right. Sondland was doing the political and personal bidding of Donald Trump in that moment. Yovanovitch wouldn't do it. I think the top line takeaway from the release of these transcripts, and the Democrats are doing this exactly right, they're trying to keep control of the narrative every single day. Yovanovitch confirms that this was a very well corroborated, complex intention of Trump world to meddle in foreign affairs and do so to benefit the president personally. She actually mentions both Giuliani and Don Jr. by name as meddling. McKinley says the reason I resigned was because this administration is asking ambassadors to do work to benefit the president politically, personally, and I'm not going to do it. The 2 themes that caught me that I think may be underreported because the facts are so glaring. The first is the security issue that you opened with about Yovanovitch. This is serious. We've sat around this table. We've talked about how Trump emboldened Charlottesville. We've talked about how Trump emboldened attacks on Elijah Cummings in the city of Baltimore, about AOC, about the bomber in his van who wanted to shoot up the press corps, and how the president gave comfort to these people. Here he is suggesting that Yovanovitch is somehow a dirty ambassador who's not supporting Donald Trump. And she actually says, I had to leave the country because there was a fear, a personal fear. That is because of...
Not on her part, among her superiors at the State Department.
Among her superiors.
They removed her from the country.
Specifically because of the environment created by the President of the United States and his henchmen, Giuliani, Don Jr., and others. The other thing that I don't think will be touched on is if you read through the transcript, look at how Republicans behaved. Not a single one of them was concerned about her security. Not a single one of them was concerned about this end around U.S. policy. Not a single one was concerned about U.S. national security. It was all attacks on the investigators and undermining the credibility of witnesses. It was one more scurrilous moment from Republicans. And for them to suggest that they were locked out, they actually were there. And there's a reason they probably didn't want these transcripts released, because it showed juvenile behavior on behalf of leading Republicans who were in the room who had no interest in U.S. national security.
All right, and because I take every description of an underreported story as a personal challenge, let me get to the McKinley. So you mentioned Ambassador Michael McKinley.
Right.
I think that I hope it doesn't go underreported. I mean, Mike Pompeo was revealed as a big fat liar. And so not only is he a horrific television guest. I mean, I watched that Sunday show appearance with George Stephanopoulos, and I've heard from sources that he was furious about it. He should have been. It was terrible. He is found in this sworn testimony from Ambassador McKinley to have lied when he was asked about whether or not he heard from advisors asking him to go out on a limb and protect and defend Yovanovitch. So from the McKinley transcripts, McKinley, again, former senior advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, testified to this. This is the second set of transcripts that were released today. So McKinley says, Morgan reached out to me by phone and told me that the secretary had decided it was better not to release a statement at this time, and that it would be in part to protect Yovanovitch, not to draw any attention to her. So he doesn't want to draw any attention to her by defending her from the president he serves, whose endorsement he might need when he runs for Senate. How many conversations did you have with the secretary about this matter? McKinley says 3. Probably. And the subsequent ones were in the context of, because if I can remind, I presented my resignation on Monday, September 30th. So it wasn't very long after the initial conversation. And in presenting my resignation, I made clear that I was looking to leave the department. I wasn't looking to create any news story out of it, but that he should be aware that, of course, part of the reason people were very aware that I was concerned about what I saw as the lack of public support for department employees. 3 times. McKinley said he went to Pompeo three times. Here's what Pompeo said. Watch.
You know, from the time that Ambassador Yovanovitch departed Ukraine until the time that he came to tell me that he was departing, I never heard him say a single thing about his concerns with respect to the decision.
So you were never asked to put out
not once, George, did Ambassador McKinley say something to me during that entire time period.
Ron Klain?
Well, I mean, not once turns out to be true, because it was 3 times. See, so you just have to be more clever about this, Nicole. Look, I mean, this whole thing, you read the McKinley transcript, you read the Yovanovitch transcript, it looks like American foreign policy has become a cross between the Three Stooges and The Godfather. I mean, it's an amazing mix of venal, violent corruption and complete and utter incompetence. And that's a toxic combination when you put it together. And you left out, as long as we're going to go underreported, the fact that at one point in time, Secretary Pompeo said he had to call Sean Hannity to find out what U.S. foreign policy was in one of these transcripts. So, I mean, the level of insanity and craziness and venality is just unmatched in all of this.
You know, Karine, I take all these notes about underreported. We're going to end with the lightning round. You can all play the anchor and pull the part of the transcript out that you think I ignored. But what comes through is precisely the theme that I think is breaking through to the public. What they see, and the public, I mean, there are not a lot of depictions of ambassadors. It's not like the FBI, where there are lots of movie depictions. Ambassadors are largely anonymous. They're unknown, but a parade of them. And we today have 500 pages of their testimony. They were scared. They were smeared. They were removed from foreign countries. Again, not because they were under risk from the foreign countries in which they served, but they were threatened by American political leaders, Donald Trump, Mike Pompeo, and Rudy Giuliani. It's staggering.
It is staggering. And these depositions that we're reading, that we're looking at right now, I mean, they're vile, they're serious, they're chilling, they're devastating. And it just shows how broken our foreign policy is under this president. And, and it's something that you guys said earlier, it's all for his own personal interests, not the national security, not for our safety, for his own political gain, to get dirt, to go after his own political rivals. And there's something that you guys said that I want to touch on even more, which is this is just the iceberg. How about other countries? Yeah. Like, what are the conversations? How about that secret server, right? That we don't know what's in there, what's going on with that secret server. So
wait, can I just follow? Question. I think this is exactly right, because why would he describe it as a perfect call? He'd only describe it as a perfect call if he's had a lot of calls like that.
Exactly, right, because he's done it before, right? And there's still, remember, he had this meeting with Putin that we just don't know anything about. So there is a fear here that we should all be having, is what is this president doing with our foreign policy that we just don't even know about?
I want to add one thing. I'm going to take a host prerogative. One of the things that is in this transcript is Yovanovitch's sort of deep knowledge of a lot of what's reported in depth in the New York Times reporting today, in the Washington Post, and we're going to get to it later, but about Yovanovitch's knowledge of sort of the dark ops. She knew that Rudy Giuliani had essentially poisoned Trump's mind about the origins of the Ukrainian sort of conspiracy theory that his own Homeland Security advisor, Tom Bossert, tried to disavow him of. She testifies that she's asked about concerns from the Ukrainians about these conspiracy theories that were out there. Questioner, what were his concerns as expressed to you? Yovanovitch says he thought it was very dangerous that Ukraine, since independence, has had bipartisan support from both Democrats and Republicans all these years, and that to start kind of getting into U.S. politics, into U.S. domestic politics, was a dangerous place for Ukraine to be. Why did he think he would be getting into U.S. domestic politics by speaking to Giuliani? Well, because he told me that because of what you've mentioned before, the issue of the Black Ledger, Mr. Manafort's resignation from the Trump campaign as a result. So when Manafort got caught with his pro-Russian dirty book of business in Ukraine, that was now manifesting itself in the Trump-Ukrainian relationship. It just stinks to high heaven.
Yeah, Manafort has been convicted of a crime. And let's be very clear. He was working for the Russian-backed politicians and oligarchs inside of Ukraine before there was a movement to remove them. The other thing that's so important, Nicole, in reading that, Rudy Giuliani is not a U.S. official. Right. He has no role in American foreign policy. He has no business interacting with American foreign policy. He's just the president's private attorney. And yet he is more empowered than our ambassador in the country, right? And this is a country that we have enormous leverage over, right? They depend on the assistance. The assistance that was used as leverage in a quid pro quo in exchange for dirt on Biden, or an investigation of Biden. They are so vulnerable to that kind of leverage because they need that assistance, right? And so it's even more insidious, the fact that you have someone not in the U.S. government leveraging U.S. foreign assistance to get this very vulnerable country that is at the center of a lot of American national security interests to do Trump's bidding. And on this other point of, like, what other countries? I sat at this table with you, Nicole, to talk about the fact that when Trump met with Putin, there was not even a U.S. interpreter allowed into that meeting. What is being discussed with Putin? Mohammed bin Salman, we know that relationship with Saudi Arabia that sits on trillions of dollars of oil reserves and money, that Jared Kushner has been deputized to be in that relationship. So the reason this matters so much is we're learning how they conduct foreign policy. And it's not a leap to think that this is how they're conducting it in other places. And for the Republicans in Congress to not treat this seriously is actually them saying, we're okay with that. We're okay with complete corruption of American foreign policy for the president's personal interest. And frankly, we're okay with putting a country that has been invaded by Vladimir Putin's Russia in this position. That I think Republicans really need to stop and think hard about whether they want to keep going down this rabbit hole.
Phil Rucker, let me ask you to sort of try to wrap up everything the White House faces today. The White House has the transparency that it sent its sycophants out to demand in their, pocket protector storming of the SCIFs. What's the strategy for dealing with the substance here, or is that not on the agenda?
Well, Nicole, it seems to be evolving. The strategy through the first sort of month and a half of this impeachment inquiry had been to ignore the substance and focus all the attacks on the process, to accuse, to give Adam Schiff a nickname, to accuse him of subverting the process of doing all of this work in the middle of the day, in the dark, in the basement of the Capitol. Well, now Trump is yelling at Republican allies to get out there and defend him on the substance, but they're not really armed with credible arguments to defend him on the substance. That has been a huge frustration among Republicans on Capitol Hill, who feel like they can't defend the president because they're not being given the full facts from the White House about what exactly the president did and what other people in the government were doing with regards to Ukraine. The president is irritated that he's not getting these full-throated defenses out there, but a lot of Republicans are unwilling to stake their own credibility and reputations on the line to defend him on the substance. And so that's why you've seen such a focus on these process attacks and these political attacks. And I think in the weeks to come, we're going to see it become even more political because this will become a more public process with public hearings. There's an effort outside by Steve Bannon and some other Trump allies, including Congressman Mark Meadows, to really kick up a lot of dust around these witnesses, to get opposition research out there and to just try to discredit them publicly before they testify.
Phil Rucker, that sounds like a bombshell. Tell me more. The plan is to continue to smear Yovanovitch, and the testimony today reveals that she still feels threatened. There was a repeated taunt of Colonel Vindman over the weekend. That's the plan?
Well, you're seeing pieces of it. There's a podcast that Steve Bannon has been doing on the side where he's talking about a lot of this. You're seeing a lot of conservative media organs that are friendly to the president writing pieces about some of these witnesses. And you actually heard the president himself over the weekend, I believe, in an answer to a question from Kelly O'Donnell of NBC, suggesting that he knew there was some negative information that's going to be coming out soon about Lieutenant Colonel Vindman. And so I think as the hearings become more public, there's a real desire by the president himself and his allies to discredit these witnesses and make them appear to be partisan actors.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.